The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
Very warm welcome to Squawk Box Europe with Karen Cho and myself, Steve Sedgwick, and these are your headlines. The White House says a decision on whether to directly strike Iran will be made within 2 weeks, whilst Iran's foreign minister plans to meet his European counterparts in Geneva today in a last-ditch push for a deal.
Spain pushes back against NATO's call to raise defence spending to 5% of GDP, with Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez calling the goal counterproductive. We'll hear from the new US ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, at 8:30 London time. Unicredit CEO Andrea Orcel says his bank is likely to withdraw its offer for Banco BPM just a day after receiving conditional EU approval, saying he's confident of a bright future with or without consolidation.
All right, there's an enormous amount going on in the world on the politics, geopolitics, economics, corporate, M&A, and Karen and I will do justice to that. We hope for you, our viewer, over the next 3 hours. But let's start off with the top story of the last couple of weeks. US President Donald Trump says he will make a decision on American involvement in Iran in the next 2 weeks, saying it was, quote, based on the fact that there is a substantial chance of negotiation in the near future. His statement comes as Iran and Israel trade strikes for a 7th day. Now, the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt outlined the president's key objectives.
No enrichment of a uranium, and it would absolutely not. Iran is not absolutely not able to achieve a nuclear weapon. The president has been very clear about that. And by the way, the deal that Special Envoy Witkoff proposed to the Iranians was both realistic and acceptable within its terms, and that's why the president is sent that deal to them.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu weighed in on potential US involvement, saying any help is welcome.
I'm determined that we will achieve all our goals, all their nuclear facilities. We can do this. But the decision of President Trump, whether he wants to join or not again, is his decision. He will do what is good for the United States, and I will do what is good for the state of Israel. And I must say that up until this moment, everyone's doing what is called for. Any help is welcome.
OK, so diplomacy first, hopefully. Foreign ministers from Germany, France and the UK will meet with the Iranian foreign minister, that's Abbas Araghchi, in Geneva today, in a bid to de-escalate the conflict with Israel. Officials are also expected to discuss a framework for resuming observation of the country's nuclear programme. Delighted to welcome to the top of the show, a real expert on this, that's Steve Killalay, who is founder and chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace. Steve, I hope you take this in the right vein, but I'm going to pick you up straight away on some notes I've received for you as well. And we're talking about, obviously, concern about destabilisation in the region as well. And one of the bullets that you sent over, and I hope this is accurate because I'm going to go into some detail on it. So it says here, Israel's actions have pushed the Middle East into deeper instability, contributing to the region's 10th year as the least peaceful globally. Can I push back on that and say, actually, it's the Iranian actions destabilising the region? It's the Iranian actions backing the Houthis and the disruption of the Straits of Hormuz and the Red Sea there. It's the Iranians who backed Hamas, who basically then created that raid on Israel in 2023. And it's the Iranians who have an illegal weapons programme with the IAEA saying that actually they are in breach of non-proliferation as well. Yes, the Israelis have taken the fight to the Iranians, but isn't it the Iranians who basically have been the bad actors in this region?
Well, I think what you'd see really is Israel's fighting 7 wars. That's according to Netanyahu. So I think what we're seeing now, the latest, is the actions between Iran and Israel. Yeah. And it's pretty well debatable what will come as the outcome of it. So now it's quite likely if the US gets involved, now that's going to suck more countries in the Middle East. So we've just seen overnight that some of the militias in Iraq are now saying if the US gets involved, then they'll attack the bases there. And if you get a spread of it also, that now starts to affect the global economy. Given the global economy is so weak at the moment, I think we need to take caution wherever we can.
Again, I'm going to be robust in my response, if I may. The US is already involved. Now, okay, B-3 bombers are not dropping bunker busters on Pickaxe Mountains, what have you. But the US weaponry is highly involved. US defense infrastructure is highly involved in defending Israel. US intelligence is highly involved in the Israeli actions on Iran as well. Okay, the US directly isn't sending its fighters, although we know that the Nimitz aircraft carrier group is going to the area, so they have 2 aircraft carrier groups in the region. But the US is highly involved already. It's just not dropping the bombs themselves.
Well, there's a big difference between supplying weapons, which many, many countries do to Israel, and another one with actually putting your troops on the ground and fighting. Now, we can look at the let's say regime change in Iran. Now, if we go back and we have a look at the last few places we tried regime change, it's turned out to be terrible. Think about Iraq, think about Syria, think about Libya. And they have all caused flow-on effects into other parts of the world. If you went to the Sahel, for example, and you looked at the terrorist activity in the Sahel, a lot of that's a direct related...
But we can't leave Iran to create a nuclear weapon in the region, can we?
Oh, I'm totally opposed to having nuclear weapons in the region. In fact, the less nuclear weapons, the better. Israel is the only country at the moment with the nuclear weapons in the region. But according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, they think they're a few years away. Even US intelligence is saying that. So do we need to start a war now? Maybe not.
So to the point as to what happens over the next fortnight, we've got about a 2-week window effectively where negotiations happen or a decision is made to press the button after the formal plans of a strike on Iran have been approved by the president. What do you make of what could happen in back channels behind the scenes?
Well, I think it's difficult to know. I think the world's guessing at where President Trump's mind's at. And I think if you look inside Magna, you'll find that maybe half the members there of his core constituency are opposed to further foreign engagements. But on the other hand, there's a very, very strong element within his camp too, which is very pro-Israel. So at this stage, it's hard to know. It's hard to know. But what I would hope is that all sides pull back, because the outcome of war is horrific. Just look at Gaza.
You mentioned some of the actors behind the scenes in terms of the Supreme Leader and what could be taking place if there is regime change. And there is a view that the Revolutionary Guard has been fairly strong and pivotal in keeping the Supreme Leader in place. If there were to be fractures here, what sort of consolidation of power could we see by these particular very strong armed military in terms of taking power in Iran?
Well, it could be that you end up with people even more radical. Now, if you're looking at the population of Iran, there was a lot of people who were dissatisfied with the government. The economic performance hasn't been good. They're not happy with a lot of the religious crackdowns on free speech and the way people dress. And so all of this just unites the nation around a common enemy.
In terms of something you mentioned right at the top, Steve, and this was the increase in military spending in the region. We've seen a huge increase, and a lot of it obviously has been directed at US munitions being bought by Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and pretty much the whole of the GCC as well. None of these nations have, I mean, there was a conflict with the Saudi and the Houthis, but actually none of this weaponry is being used against Iran or has been used at any stage as well. Do you have concern that actually other nations will be dragged into this on one side or t'other? Because it seems to me that the GCC, despite having this enormous weaponry available, is actually pretty adept at staying out of these conflicts.
Yeah, I think if you're looking at the oil-rich nations like Saudi, UAE, Qatar, they're not interested in getting involved in any conflict.
So why do they buy all this weaponry?
Well, I think it's the insurance. I think a lot of it's insurance, yeah. So, but if we look over the last decade, for example, the two countries on a per capita basis have got the most weapons have been Iran and Israel. And there we are.
While we're talking about weapons, let me be slightly provocative here about the use of these weapons in real-life hot conflicts, because there's been a lot of use cases, there's been a lot of testing of military equipment, and we've seen that through the Russia-Ukraine situation, we've seen in the Middle East. Why would the Americans not deploy the bunker buster to see the real-life capabilities of it?
Well, I think it's the flow-on factors. And now it's the flow-on factors. And so you've got Iraq. They've had a lot of issues in Iraq in the past. And if you've got the militias there now starting to attack American bases, that starts to drag them further in the war in the Middle East. President Trump came in with one of his mandates was, I'm not going to get involved in foreign wars. In fact, it was the America First policy.
To mine the Straits of Hormuz isn't the most complicated thing in the world, so the reaction from the Iranians could be quite enormous, plus what else they could do in the region. There's a vast amount of US personnel at various areas dotted around the region as well. Steve, I want to ask you a question that has been debated and ad infinitum, and it's a bigger question. Military spending in your home country, both of you, Australia and Asia and the Middle East, it's gone up aggressively. It's going up. I'm going to NATO in a couple of days as well. They're asking for 5% from the current 2% as well, and you know they're going to get somewhere in between probably as well. Military spending increases, do they A, avert war, or B, lead to war? And it's a question, I know it's an existential, it's a huge question as well, but I mean, obviously as we saw in the 1930s, if perhaps certain nations had spent more on military spending then, may have averted war. But actually then there is a concern now that all this military spending around the world can only lead to one consequence.
Well, look, I think it's a complicated question, but if we're looking at the EU, for example, what we find is that they spend about 4 times the amount of money on defence as what Russia does. Now, the Russian economy is about...
The Russians spend on their military-industrial complex over 20% of their GDP on a per capita basis, on a percent of GDP basis on their spending. Europe spends roughly 2%.
Yeah, but on the other hand, the Russian economy is the same size as France.
Yeah.
And so when
Russia happens to have over 1,000
you start to add the 23 countries
ballistic
together,
missiles armed with nuclear weapons.
But if you start to add together the expenses for the 23 countries in Europe, it comes out different. But the bigger point is that they are spending more. The problem is that their military capabilities are only 1/3 more. So the real issue for me is the integration and the strategic alignment of the various EU countries. So a lot of them, for example, are competing in defence spending. So they, rather than having an integrated supply chain, they don't.
Yeah,
it's fractured. So for me, the big question is how do you actually get the efficiency and improve the way they actually fight? Yeah. But that's a bigger question for the EU. You can make the same argument for the EU and its economy.
So there's execution risk is what you're saying around this big defence spending program.
Yes. The other thing too is, like with defence spending, and it's needed, so this is not an argument against defence spending, but government's got limited budgets. So where do you take that 2% to 5% from? Do you take it out of health? Do you take it out of education? Business stimulus packages, which you really need? Now, also, if you're looking through the EU countries too, there's a lot of the social unrest. Now, you take money out of these programs which improve social cohesion, you're likely now to get more internal unrest. So there's a trade-off.
In Riga, in Vilnius, in Tallinn, in Warsaw, they would say to you, forget about your healthcare program, forget about your social unrest, forget about other infrastructure projects, because if you haven't got defence and security of your borders, you can forget about the others because the Russians will be rolling their tanks over the border.
Great, and if that's the country's consensus, it's good, but you're not going to find the same consensus in Germany or the Netherlands.
Well, there was a reason why there was such a huge military build-up in the Rhine area and in Russia, in West Germany for about 40, 50 years. And that's because it was a very real fear as well. So I think you're getting more of a consensus in Germany at the moment. But I mean, that's another debate for another time. We have to leave it. I love the conversation.
Great, been a good one.
Thank you so much indeed. And it was an important conversation, one we need to carry on having. Steve Killalea, who is the founder and chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace, IEP.
Well, let's talk about NATO. NATO leaders will gather at a summit in The Hague next week, where they are expected to discuss a proposal for allies to boost defence expenditure to 5% of GDP, as called for by US President Donald Trump. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has unveiled a plan which would break down the 5% target, with 3.5% on core military spending and the remainder on defence-related projects. Rutte initially set a 2032 deadline for the increase. However, this may be pushed back. At least one member has objected to the increased expenditure, with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez pushing back on the target as unreasonable in a letter to the NATO Secretary General, which is fascinating because don't forget, the Spanish are actually one of the stronger economies right now. Now, the 5%...
Well, that's their problem. Because they're worried if the economy grows, they're going to have to spend a greater amount of actual real money rather than the relative amount of money as a percentage. But I think Mr. Sanchez is a very adept politician. But the fact of the matter is, the Spanish are barely even getting to 2%. That was agreed 20 years ago.
Yeah. There's a gap. But so how does it work? So if you have a very strong economy one year, you have to spend 5% of that GDP for that designated year.
Going to get to 5%.
But then if
it's a bargaining
But then
tool.
if the economy slumps the next year, what happens then? You spend less that year?
Well, I mean, defence spending is normally a multi-year commitment as well. That's why we just had a big spending defence view in the United Kingdom. The fact of the matter is,
it's not going to be as bumpy as I suggest.
The Spanish are not pulling their weight. They're one of the top 4 economies in Europe, and for decades they haven't spent their commitment. If they signed up to the deal in the noughties to spend 2%, they should have got to 2% by now as well. I agree that 5% is stunningly demanding, and I don't know many nations that can do it without special deficit procedures. I mean, the Poles are not bankrupting themselves, but spending a vast amount of money getting to 5%. But there are only limited countries that are getting anywhere near 3%. So there's a deal to be done somewhere in between.
Isn't Spain a great example? We were both in Spain over the years, in the past decade or so, as we're talking about the cleanup from a big housing boom and bust there. I mean, it was a country where the NPLs grew for a lot of the banks and then obviously tried to get themselves back on track and had a huge amount of success doing so. Tourism has worked in their favour, but it's not been the easiest path economically for a country like Spain over the last decade plus. So I think as we talk about their commitments and their ability to spend more.
Bit lame. I'll come back at you. Where was the epicentre of the crisis? It wasn't Madrid. We could probably argue it was Athens, yeah? What do the Greeks spend? Do the Greeks have problems getting to 2%? No, the Greeks spend 3.2% of GDP. Now, admittedly, there are regional issues and they've got regional rivalries, but they still spend over 3%.
A lot of actors in there, though. I mean, you were there for the Troika days, too, in terms of putting the country's finances back on track.
But, I mean, one could argue, and I mean this with great politeness to my grief, it was a bigger basket case, the Greek economy, 15 years ago than the Spanish economy. There were problems, but the Greek economy, it was like, I was there with the riots on the streets, maybe. The Greeks can get to 3.2%. Why can't the Spanish get to 2%?
It's such a good debate. I mean, does it help the economy if you are plowing money into defence? Does it help in terms of the GDP numbers? The multiplier
if the Russians are over the border, what good is having a strong economy? What good is having a good welfare system? What good is having a good NHS or what have you? If you've got a threat from a malicious actor, and my goodness me, try telling the people in Tallinn, Riga and Vilnius that the Russians aren't a malicious actor.
So on that point, I wonder who we're going to send to NATO next week. I wonder who's going to be ready for it. More from next week's NATO summit. Don't miss our interview with the US Permanent Representative to NATO, Ambassador Matthew Whitaker. That is coming up at 8:30 BST. Ahead on the show, UK retail sales slump in May and a blow to UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves. We'll bring you the numbers. Plus, Unicredit CEO Andrea Orcel says the bank is likely to withdraw its offer for a fellow Italian lender, stressing the future is bright with or without M&A. And we'll be joined by the US Permanent Representative to NATO to look ahead to next week's summit in The Hague with an increase in defence spending on the table. The UK public sector net borrowing came in at £17.7 billion in May, a record level outside of the COVID pandemic, and £600 million more than the Office for Budget Responsibility forecast, albeit less than analysts had expected. Compulsory social contributions rose £1.8 billion after the government hiked employer national insurance contributions, coming in at more than £15 billion. Let's take a look at sterling and how we're travelling morning session on the trade. We are 134.79 or 80 odd now, so we picked up a little bit of pace, about 0.1% firmer. The gilt picture, we were just taking a quick look at the curve this morning, and this is how we're perched, slightly above 4.5%, also just inching positive. The FTSE for the trading year, it has been somewhat of a safe harbour for investors. The oil majors clearly pulling some weight in the latest mix as we focus on concerns in the Middle East. And of course, we are seeing just a little bit of bumpiness now as we see a pullback to the tune of 0.6% year to date, though still positive. Now, our next guest says the UK is leading on AI. Speaking at London Tech Week earlier this month, NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang laid out the stakes for the country's embrace of the technology.
The thing that is quite extraordinary, and it's an incredible opportunity for the UK, is that AI is both a technology, but it is also an infrastructure. It's an infrastructure because it affects so many industries simultaneously. And it affects, of course, healthcare and government and education and manufacturing and financial services. Because this technology is so broad and so transformative to every single industry, it will be considered infrastructure, just as electricity was infrastructure, just as information, connectivity that came about because of the internet is infrastructure. Now we're going to have a new infrastructure, and this new infrastructure is called artificial intelligence. And it's vital that we invest in this infrastructure here in the UK, and with your support we can do that.
Edward Knight joins us now, president of ATLA. Edward, I was also at London Tech Week, and I've got to say it was great to see a huge technology event in London. It's been a little bit smaller versus some of the counterparts in Paris and Lisbon, but is that symbolic of the fact that we've got a really good ecosystem now happening, capital markets are starting to form behind the unicorns, or is it just a bit of show and tell?
That's a great point. I think certainly very encouraging to see some of the initiatives that have been talked about at London Tech Week and the much needed focus which we're all going to need to be able to bring these economies up to speed. You can see that it's a central piece of any modern dynamic economy now that you have to digitize. So certainly very encouraging to see us catching up to some other parts of the world. More to do probably as well. Well,
let's start with the infrastructure, because there's no point in talking about the applications or the amazing companies if you don't have the infrastructure. And the fact that Jensen Huang stopped off in London before he went to VivaTech in Paris for GTC suggested that he thought there was a real mission to accomplish here. What does the infrastructure look like? How quickly is the build out of AI happening here in terms of those data centers and supercomputers?
Because it's a super question. We're seeing headlines almost daily now about commitments to alternative energy sources. I think just yesterday we were talking about India quadrupling their expected demand for uranium in the next 5 or 6 years as a reflection of the sheer quantity of energy that's going to be required to power these systems to get these economies digitized. And you see this as well in the Middle East with MGX and Humane most recently from the Trump visit. And so I think that one of the observations that Jensen made was that the latent talent is obviously very heavily embedded here, but what's missing is the infrastructure. And so the focus that's going to be required, which I think was discussed partly by the Prime Minister, will be the enormous build out of data centers and infrastructure that we're going to need. National Grid did an enormous rights issue at the back end of last year, reflecting the capital that's going to be required. And so these infrastructure aspects, which in some sense have been overlooked for a long period of time, are now going to get up the curve very, very quickly indeed. And I think that was the point that he was making.
Yeah, something that jumped out to me around all the conversations I had the other week was that, look, a lot of companies are still getting their house in order when it comes to the digital infrastructure inside their own buildings, their own companies, before they can plug into AI at scale. I know some industries are already being disrupted at scale, but more broadly for us to all see it in terms of a business, very large proposition for AI to be embedded in organizations, it is still taking some time. What does that mean for all these amazing startups that you're working with, trying to get the economies of scale?
Yeah, so I think it's a super point. If you look at any great tech ecosystem, actually you need a very, very significant level of base government support. We forget that actually Apple in some sense can be traced back to Eisenhower's initiatives in the 50s and 60s when the US was worried about getting left behind in the space race. If you look at some of the plants that have been built by Huawei in China, again reflecting that anxiety and that need to get up the curve and digitize very, very quickly. You need that base level of government support to get up the curve on these these initiatives. And so it's interesting, isn't it, that actually a lot of the tools that we're going to be talking about in the UK and in Europe mainly are being supplied by US firms. And it would be great to be able to supply these capabilities ourselves over time.
Yes. I mean, I was just about to talk to you about government as well. And Edward, you've already made my point. So let me just draw back on the conversations I was having yesterday. I was down celebrating AIM's 30th anniversary when a lot of other markets have disappeared. I spoke to Chris Hewlett, who's a great investor in British companies and AIM companies as well, and the CEO of London Stock Exchange. The point I have my biggest concern about is the government laying the foundations for successful long-term innovation and innovators as well. We have to incentivise these people as well to stay in the United Kingdom as well. These are my biggest concerns.
Okay, I think it's exactly the point, isn't it? Which is there needs to be an evolution of the risk mindset, because a lot of these endeavours necessarily involve a quantum of risk, which certain parts of the world are a little bit more shy towards than others. And so these are incredibly important initiatives. If you look at what's happening in China, AI has gone on the curriculum from primary school, so for children from the age of 6. We hear about Eric Schmidt from Google, who I saw a couple of weeks ago, talking about the arrival of non-human intelligence is a very big deal, which is very likely underestimated. And so this is happening, and so we can either get up the curve and incubate and provide the support and frameworks for these systems, or we can decide not to. But it sounds like these initiatives are a very big step in that direction.
And yet, big fan of the Power Law book, as indeed everyone in your industry. It's the new Bible for youngsters in the industry. And history shows that you have to incentivize the VCs, and they have to get the right remuneration. Otherwise, the rule on the power of 10 and what have you, it will perhaps dent the investment case. Now there's a flood of money coming in at an earlier stage as well. And I think you make the point as well that there is less dilution to founders and the earliest investors as well. Maybe turn that on its head. Is that a good thing, the fact there's less dilution? Because actually, one thing that the investors bring at a later stage is they actually bring expertise as well, and they bring responsibility to these amazing innovators who aren't necessarily longer-term CEOs.
Yeah, so I think, look, the industry is professionalizing. So I look at this in some ways. If you look at the chaos of venture and innovation, which has been very fragmented, if we look back to the evolution of the buyout industry from the 1990s around Blackstone, KKR and Apollo, I think there are echoes of the formation of that industry, which you can look at today and say, actually a similar thing is happening now. Venture and innovation, talent is global, tech is global, outcomes are non-linear. That lends itself to a global vision actually much more readily than the sort of a localized version, because the best founders today want that access. They want to be able to go to the West Coast or to Asia, wherever it might be. And so the industry is professionalizing. It's starting to build a framework around that.
Talent's expensive right now, I hear.
Talent's
what's
expensive.
it, 2 million is just the starting point. I think it goes up to, 100 million?
I know you're going to get a question here, but wasn't there a Microsoft OpenAI conversation? Someone was poaching for $100 million or something?
There's that. So you buy the partner now. I think you buy part of the business.
The best engineers are expensive, for sure.
Let me come to your business, because I was looking at some of the portfolio companies you've invested in. You've got an eSIMs business, AI natural language super app for South Korea, BNPL for business to business. I couldn't really see a common thread in some of the portfolio companies. What am I missing?
No, it's a great question. So our businesses, we're an early stage venture capital business. What we're looking for is really, really determined, really, really focused, ambitious young guys and girls who want to build businesses. The tools that are available to this cohort or this generation, let alone didn't exist 20 years ago, some of them didn't exist 2 years ago. And so the S-curves of adoption are going basically vertical. And so we're looking for really, really determined people who just find a way to succeed no matter what obstacles get put in front of them. Tends to be what happened. That happened with Airbnb. Who could have thought of a stranger business than renting your bedroom to a perfect stranger? Yet here we are with a $100 billion business not very many years later. So we're looking for those types of people. And in fact, the eSIM business was built over COVID. Guess what? Not many people were traveling during COVID, as you quite rightly said. So we had a couple of near-death experiences, but here he is. He's now a $1 billion company, providing a fantastic service for people who want to travel and not pay too much for their roaming charges. We have a company in Stockholm called Lovable. I'd encourage you to have a look at it. I think he's the fastest time to several tens of millions of dollars of revenues in a matter of absolute months, because as I said, the S-curves of adoption are almost going vertical. So it's not specifically that we're looking for any particular sector, so much as just looking for great people. It allows you to build apps that you want to just right in front of you. So I want to build an app which basically sells cups of tea, put it into the Google Box window, and it will build it right in front of your eyes.